The dust moved before she did. That was the first sign, a slow, heavy disturbance rising from the dry earth at the edge of the Amboseli Basin, long before the shape behind it became clear. Samuel had been watching the southern corridor since early morning, the way he always did in the dry season, when the grassland turned pale and the animals moved differently, slower, more deliberate, as though the land itself was asking them to be careful. He had his tea, he had his binoculars, he had the particular patience that 23 years in the bush quietly builds into a person, layer by layer, until waiting no longer feels like waiting, but simply like another form of watching. He saw the shape emerge from the acacia scrub just after 7. She was large. Older, by the way, she carried herself wide-shouldered, her skin deeply folded and mapped with years of sun and dust and long walking. But she was not moving the way old elephants moved when they were simply traveling. She was not plodding with that easy, rhythmic weight shift that makes a large elephant look, from a distance, almost like water moving. She was pulling herself forward with something urgent in her gait, something uneven and effortful, as though each step required a quiet decision she wasn't entirely sure she could make. Samuel set down his tea. He raised the binoculars and found her in the lens, and the first thing he noticed was her left foreleg. It swung slightly wrong, not broken, not dragging, but troubled in a way that showed in the angle of her foot and the cautious way she placed it, as if the ground beneath it had become uncertain. There was a dark, dried line running down the lower leg just above the foot. Old blood, possibly, or something deeper and slower than blood. She was favoring her right side, leaning into it with each stride, and every fourth or fifth step she paused briefly, her trunk dropping low and nearly brushing the earth, her whole body absorbing something that had no name yet but that Samuel already recognized as pain. He lowered the binoculars. She was heading toward the ranger post. That single fact made him go very still inside. In 23 years of working this stretch of southern Kenya, Samuel had watched hundreds of elephants pass near the post. They always maintained distance, not out of fear exactly, but out of that deep inherited knowledge that wild animals carry about the boundaries between their world and the human one. Elephants, especially, understood those boundaries. They taught the knowledge to their calves. They passed it down through generations of matriarch memory, that invisible line between the watched and the watchers, between the wild and the built. She was crossing it. He stepped out slowly from beneath the shade of the corrugated roof. Behind him, he heard Jonas appear in the doorway, his younger colleague, who had been sorting fuel receipts at the inside table, and without turning, Samuel raised one hand. A quiet signal. Stay, be still, don't speak. The morning held itself in complete silence. Not even the fork-tailed drongos called from the fever trees. The light was still low and golden, the kind of morning light that makes the dust look like it has weight, like it could be touched. She stopped approximately 40 meters from where Samuel stood. She stood there in the open ground between the last line of acacias and the post, and she breathed visibly, heavily, her entire barrel chest rising and falling in long, deliberate movements. Her ears were not spread wide in the way elephants hold them when they are assessing a threat. They hung low, at half-mast, resting against the sides of her great head with a looseness that spoke not of aggression but of exhaustion, of something inside her that had quieted past the point of alertness, past the point of calculation, into something more elemental and more difficult to name. And then Samuel saw what the distance and the dust and the morning haze had kept from him until now. Her face was wet. The land around them was parched. There had been no rain in 11 days, and the nearest water source was 4 kilometers east. But along the inner corners of her eyes, trailing down from the temporal glands that sat in the broad, creased skin on either side of her face, there were dark and glistening lines. Elephants produce this secretion, a thick, dark fluid from the temporal glands during periods of extreme physiological stress, reproductive activity, or profound emotional disturbance. It is a biological response, documented and measurable, and it carries no simple human translation. But it is not nothing. In the field, among people who have spent years watching elephants live and grieve and protect and lose, it is never nothing. She looked at him, not the way animals sometimes glance at humans, that brief, wary assessment of distance and danger, the quick calculation of whether to stay or go. She looked at him with a steadiness that was different from that. She looked at him, the way a creature looks at another when it has exhausted its other options. When it has walked as far as it could walk alone and arrived, through some combination of instinct and desperation and whatever else moves through a living animal at the edge of its endurance, at a place it had never intended to be. Samuel stood in the dust and the early light and did not move toward her. He simply allowed her to see him. "Okay," he said very quietly, to no one and to her at once. "I'm here." The words dissolved into the dry morning air without echo. She did not step forward. She did not step back. She breathed, and she stood, and she kept her dark eyes on his face, and the 40 meters of open ground between them held something that Samuel would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right words for and never quite manage. He did not move toward her immediately. That was the most important thing, the not moving. Samuel had learned this the way most things in the field are learned, not from a manual or a training session, but from the accumulated weight of years and mistakes and the slow education of watching animals respond to human presence with their entire bodies. He had learned that the fastest way to lose an animal's fragile cooperation was to interpret stillness as an invitation, to close distance before distance had been offered. So he stayed where he was, in the open ground between the post and the acacias, and he let the morning continue around them both without interference. She remained standing. That itself was significant. An elephant in genuine panic does not stand. It moves, it turns, it uses its size as both shield and declaration. The fact that she held her position, that she kept her eyes on him without the flattening of ears or the lifting of her trunk in warning, told him something he filed away carefully. She was not comfortable, she was not calm, but she had made a decision to stay. And that decision, however fragile, deserved to be honored exactly as it was. After perhaps 20 minutes, Samuel began to move, not toward her, sideways at a slow diagonal, angling left, reducing his direct frontal profile the way experienced field workers learn to do around large animals. The approach that signals, through the most basic physical language, that the human moving through the space is not a predator, not a challenge, not something that requires a response. He moved slowly enough that the movement felt like weather rather than intention. He stopped at 30 meters and crouched down low, making himself smaller against the pale ground. From here, the wound was fully visible. Whatever had entered her left foreleg had done so from the front, at a downward angle, penetrating the thick skin just above the ankle joint and sealing badly in the days since. The tissue around the wound had raised and darkened, the edges swollen in the way deep infections present themselves in large animals, not dramatically, not with the obvious rupture of an acute injury, but with that slow, insistent swelling that builds quietly over time, like water rising behind a dam. The wound itself had crusted over, the body's attempt at closure, but the color of the surrounding skin was wrong, purplish gray where it should have been the deep charcoal black of healthy elephant hide. Warm, likely, to the touch, though Samuel was nowhere near close enough to know that yet. She had been carrying this for days. That was the part that sat heavily in his chest as he crouched in the dust and studied her. Not hours, days. She had moved through the bush, with this wound through the full heat of afternoon and the cold drop of night and the long waterless stretches between sources in the dry season. She had walked while the infection built its slow case inside her tissue. And at some point he could not know exactly when she had become separated from whatever group she had belonged to. Whether the herd had moved on, or whether she had fallen behind, or whether the separation had happened in some other way that the land kept to itself, the result was the same. She had been alone with this, and alone was its own particular weight on top of everything else. Elephants are not solitary animals. Their entire architecture, social, emotional, physiological, is built around the presence of others. The matriarch's memory guides the group to water. The younger females press against the sides of the old and the injured. The calves thread through the legs of their mothers and aunts and grandmothers, as though held by invisible threads. To be separated from that web of presence is not simply to be alone in the way a solitary animal might experience solitude. It is to be missing something structural, something the body itself registers as absence. Samuel radioed Jonas without standing. He kept his voice low and level, the way voices should be kept around large animals, and he said what needed to be said: veterinary support, Kenya Wildlife Service, as soon as possible. Jonas acknowledged and moved inside, and Samuel stayed where he was, crouched in the dust, and continued his quiet vigil. After a while he rose slowly and walked back to the post without turning his back fully to her. He filled a wide, shallow water basin from the reserve tank, the large rubber kind used for the post's working animals, and carried it back out into the open ground. He set it down at roughly 25 meters, between his position and hers, and then he stepped back. 6 paces, 7, and he waited. She watched the basin, her trunk lowered toward it from a distance, reading the air above the water, processing what the scent told her. Water, yes, and the particular mineral flatness of stored water rather than the living complexity of a natural source, but water nonetheless. She did not move toward it immediately. She stood with her trunk extended partway, her weight still favoring her right side, and she considered the basin with the careful attention of an animal that has learned, through long experience, that the world does not offer things without conditions. The decision, when it came, was quiet. A single step forward, then another, the slow closing of distance between her pain and the one thing that could address at least part of it. She reached the basin and drank deep, long pulls, the water level dropping visibly, her whole body shifting subtly with the effort of it. Jonas had come to the doorway at some point. Samuel heard him stop there. Neither of them spoke. "That's it," Samuel said eventually under his breath, to no one in particular. "Take your time." The sound of her drinking carried clearly across the still morning air, rhythmic, steady, alive. It was the most ordinary sound in the world, and it was, in that moment, the only sound that mattered. The veterinary vehicle came up the southern track just before midday, raising its own thin line of dust against the white sky. Dr. Amara Osei stepped out first. She was a compact, unhurried woman who had spent 11 years working with the Kenya Wildlife Service Large Mammal Unit, and she moved through field situations with the particular quality of stillness that develops in people who have learned, through long and sometimes difficult experience, that speed and noise are almost always the wrong answer. She did not walk toward the elephant immediately. She stood beside the vehicle door and looked at the scene in front of her, the open ground, the post, the old elephant standing 40 meters out, and she read it the way a person reads a room they have just entered, taking the temperature of everything before deciding how to move within it. She looked at Samuel. He was sitting on an upturned water crate near the post's outer wall, close enough to remain visible to the elephant, but far enough to give her space. He had been in roughly the same position for the better part of 4 hours. There were things that posture communicated that no radio report could: the quality of the waiting, the degree of the animal's stability, the texture of the trust that had or hadn't developed in the time between the call and the arrival. "She came to you?" Amara said quietly. It was not quite a question. "Just after 7, Samuel said. Walked straight in." Amara nodded once and turned back to study the elephant. Her team, 3 people, all experienced, all moving with the same calibrated quiet, began unloading equipment from the vehicle. Cases were placed on the ground, not on the metal roof rack. Latches were opened slowly. No one spoke above a murmur. This was not performance. It was practice built from years of understanding that large animals process sound and movement together, that the acoustic texture of an environment tells them as much as its visual content, and that humans who understand this move and speak accordingly. The elephant had watched the vehicle arrive. Her ears had shifted at the sound of the engine, a slight spreading, a brief alertness, but she had not retreated. She stood where she had stood through most of the morning, her weight settled onto her right side, her left foreleg held with that careful elevation that had not changed since Samuel first observed it. She watched the new humans with the same measured attention she had given Samuel, not hostile, not relaxed, but somewhere in the difficult middle ground that injured wild animals sometimes occupy when exhaustion has worn the sharp edge off fear. Amara approached the way Samuel had, diagonally, unhurried, reducing her profile. She stopped at 25 meters and stood still and let the elephant complete whatever assessment she needed to complete. The trunk came up part way, reading the air, processing the new information. The ears adjusted again, then, gradually, they lowered back to their resting position, and Amara released a slow, quiet breath. The sedation protocol for a wild elephant of her size required careful preparation. Amara estimated her weight at somewhere between 3,800 and 4,200 kilograms Based on shoulder height and body condition, she was lean from the injury and the days of compromised movement, her hip bones more prominent than they should have been, her temporal hollows slightly sunken. The dosage was calculated conservatively. The dart was prepared with the same unhurried precision that had characterized everything the team had done since arriving. The dart rifle was a tool that always carried a particular kind of weight in a field situation, not the weight of harm, but the weight of responsibility and of the knowledge that what happened in the next few minutes would determine a great deal about what happened after. Amara checked the dart twice. She positioned herself at the correct distance and angle behind the elephant's left shoulder, targeting the large muscle mass that offered the safest and most effective delivery. She waited for the elephant to stand square. The dart found its mark cleanly. The elephant startled a sharp, full-body flinch, her ears spreading wide, her trunk swinging up in a single swift motion. She took 2 fast steps forward and then stopped, turning her great head, her eyes finding Samuel where he sat beside the post wall. He had not moved. He was exactly where he had been all morning, steady, present, unchanged. She looked at him for a long moment, her breathing elevated, her ears still partially spread. Then, slowly, the ears began to lower. The drug worked through her system over the following minutes with a gradual, deepening effect. Her movements slowed. The tension that had been visible in her posture, that constant, effortful bracing against the pain, began to release by degrees. Her trunk lowered. Her head dropped slightly. When her legs finally began to fold, they did so with a kind of enormous, measured dignity, a slow surrender to the ground that took nearly a full minute, her body leaning into the earth by stages, her right side taking her weight as she went down, until she was lying on the pale dust with the full, still weight of her years. The team moved in immediately but without urgency. Amara went directly to the wound. What she found when she examined it closely confirmed what the visual presentation had already suggested: a deep puncture wound, almost certainly from a metal stake or a section of old wire fencing that had penetrated the soft tissue above the ankle joint and introduced infection into the layers beneath. The wound had been present for at least 4 days, possibly closer to a week. The infection had not yet reached the joint itself, which was the most critical finding. Joint involvement in an elephant of her age would have carried a far more serious prognosis. But the tissue damage was significant, and the systemic effects of the infection were visible in her body condition, her sunken temples, her dry and cracked skin. Amara worked with a focused, unhurried thoroughness. The wound was cleaned in stages, debris removed, necrotic tissue carefully debrided, the cavity flushed repeatedly with saline solution. A long-acting antibiotic compound was packed into the wound. A biodegradable field dressing was applied and secured. An injectable antibiotic was administered alongside supportive fluids. The whole process took 50 minutes, conducted in near silence, the team communicating through small gestures and the shorthand of people who have worked together long enough to no longer need words for most things. Samuel had moved closer during the treatment, not to the animal, but to a position where he remained in her line of sight. He sat on the ground at roughly 3 meters from her head, his arms resting on his knees, his presence quiet and constant. Her eye, half open during the sedation, was visible from where he sat, dark and deep and rimmed with pale lashes, the temporal gland trails still faintly visible on the dry skin of her cheek. He did not touch her. That was not his role, and he understood it precisely. But he stayed within her field of vision, a fixed and familiar point in a morning that had asked a great deal of her, and that, in its own modest way, was everything he had to offer. The reversal agent was administered at 2:17 in the afternoon. Amara withdrew the syringe and stepped back without a word, and the team followed her lead instinctively, each person moving quietly to a greater distance, creating the wide, respectful space that a waking elephant requires and deserves. The protocol was clear, and everyone present understood it. But there was always something beyond protocol in these moments, something that no written guideline fully captured: the particular quality of attention that descends on a group of people watching a large animal return to itself, the held breath stillness of it, the awareness that what happened in the next several minutes belonged entirely to the animal and not to them. The first movement was her trunk. It shifted against the pale dust, a slow, involuntary curl, the tip dragging a small arc through the dry earth before uncurling again. Then her ears moved, twitching once at the outer edges, the way ears do when the nervous system is rebooting, running its quiet checks before committing to full wakefulness. Her breathing, which had been slow and deep during the procedure, began to change, the intervals shortening, the chest movements becoming more deliberate, more conscious. Her eye, which had been half-lidded and unfocused throughout the treatment, opened fully, and held the particular faraway expression of an animal not yet entirely present in the world it has returned to. Samuel watched from his position on the ground, close enough to be seen, far enough not to crowd the process. He had sat in this same spot for the better part of an hour while Amara's team worked, and he had not moved to stand yet. He stayed low, staying small, letting her find her bearings without the additional information of a human rising suddenly at the edge of her vision. The rising took 3 attempts. The first brought her partway, her front legs pushing against the earth, her trunk bracing, her hindquarters lifting briefly before the effort became too much and she settled back. The second attempt was stronger, more coordinated, but the angle was wrong and she shifted her weight and paused. The third attempt was the one that held. She came up in stages, her body finding its vertical by degrees, knees first, then haunches, then the full rocking commitment of her weight, transferring upward, and then she was standing, swaying slightly, her legs making small adjustments beneath her enormous frame, her head hanging low as the last of the sedation moved through her system and dispersed. The team stayed back. No one spoke. She stood in the afternoon light with her dressed foreleg held slightly elevated, testing the new sensation of the bandaged wound cautiously, the way an animal tests any unfamiliar thing, with patience, with incremental small movements, with a wariness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the careful intelligence of a creature that has survived long enough to be old. After a moment, she placed the foot down, lifted it again, placed it down once more, with a fraction more weight, and held it there. Then she raised her head. It happened before the sound reached the humans she knew, before they did, the way elephants always know, through the infrasound frequencies that travel through the ground itself and bypass the threshold of human hearing entirely. Her head came up with a sudden, complete attention that was unlike anything she had displayed all day. Her ears spread wide, not in alarm, but in the full, forward-facing posture of an elephant receiving information. Her trunk rose, her whole body reoriented toward the south, toward the dark line of the acacia tree line 300 meters away, with the focused, total quality of an animal that has just heard its name called in a language older than any sound. The rumble reached the humans a moment later. It came through the ground first, a vibration that moved up through the soles of their boots and registered somewhere below the sternum before the ears confirmed it as sound. Low, sustained, and layered, carrying within its frequency the dense information that elephant infrasound encodes: location, identity, urgency, recognition. It was not a single voice. It was several, overlapping, building into something that was less a sound than a condition of the air itself. The shapes emerged from the tree line without hesitation. 7 elephants, moving in a loose, purposeful cluster through the dry grass. 2 adult females leading, their strides long and ground covering without breaking into a run, the particular gait of animals moving with intention but maintaining the composure of maturity. Behind them, a younger male, his head slightly lowered. 2 more adult females flanking the outside edges of the group, and pressed close against the bodies of the inner females, nearly hidden by the bulk of the adults around them. 2 calves, small and round-headed, their legs churning to keep pace, their trunks swinging with the uncoordinated energy of the very young. She answered them. The sound she produced came from deep within her chest, a long, low exhalation of infrasound that rolled back across the open ground toward the approaching group. Her ears were fully spread now, her tail lifted, her posture transformed from the exhausted, careful stillness of an animal in pain into something more awake, more present, more entirely itself than anything the team had witnessed from her all day. She took a step toward them, then another. The dressed foreleg moved with a new kind of deliberateness, not without care, but with purpose behind the care, which is a different thing entirely. The group reached her in less than a minute. The first elephant to arrive was a younger female, broad-faced, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, who walked directly into her side without slowing, pressing her shoulder against the older elephant's shoulder with a force that was not gentle but was entirely right, the kind of contact that does not ask permission because it has never needed to. She held there, pressed against her, and the older elephant leaned into it with the full weight of everything the day had cost her. The calves came next. They moved under and around the adult bodies with the fluid, instinctive confidence of animals for whom large legs are simply a landscape to navigate, and they reached up with their small trunks touching her face, her chin, the sides of her mouth in the rapid, exploratory way that young elephants investigate everything that matters to them. She lowered her head toward them. The rumbling from the group had become something continuous and layered, a frequency that seemed to saturate the air around all of them. Amara stood 12 meters away and did not move. None of them moved. Jonas had both hands in his jacket pockets. One of the junior team members had turned slightly away, not from discomfort but from the particular overwhelm of witnessing something that makes the chest feel briefly too full. Samuel remained on the ground where he had been sitting all afternoon, his arms on his knees, and he watched the old elephant receive her family back into her body like something that had been missing from the world was being quietly, completely restored. "There they are," he said, almost without sound. Not to anyone, just to the afternoon. The herd settled around her in the unhurried way of animals that have found what they were looking for and have no reason left to hurry. Bodies pressed together, breathing synchronized, the calves stilled, and the southern light, falling long and golden across the pale grass, held all of them, the elephants, the humans, the dust, the dressed wound, the mourning that had led to this afternoon in one unmoving moment that none of the people present would ever find adequate words to describe. They left the way herds leave without announcement, without a moment that could be clearly identified afterward as the moment of departure. One of the adult females simply began walking south, her stride unhurried and even, and the rest of the group adjusted around that movement the way a body of water adjusts around a stone dropped into it naturally, completely, without deliberation. The calves moved with them, tucked close to their mother's sides. The younger male drifted to the outer edge of the group, and the old elephant, the one who had stood in the open ground that morning with wet eyes and a wound she could not name and a need she could not have articulated in any language, moved with them, her body settling back into the rhythm of the herd as though it had never left. Her gait was not what it would become. The foreleg still carried its careful elevation on each stride, still placed itself with a precision that was different from the loose, rolling walk of the healthy elephants around her. The field dressing was visible against the dark skin, pale and clean against everything else, but she was moving. She was moving within the press and warmth of her family, and there was a quality to her carriage that had not been present that morning, something in the way she held her head, the way her trunk swung with a slightly easier arc that spoke of a body no longer entirely alone with what it was carrying. The team stood and watched. There was nothing else to do, and they all understood that without being told. The equipment was packed, the vehicle was loaded. The work of the day was complete in every technical and documentable sense. But none of them moved toward the vehicle yet, because there are moments in field work that ask to be witness to their conclusion, and everyone present recognized this as one of them. They stood in a loose, informal line in the late afternoon light, Amara with her arms folded, her chin slightly raised, the junior team members quiet and still, Jonas at the edge of the post shade, and they watched the herd move south across the pale grass toward the tree line. Samuel stood slightly apart from the others. He had risen from the ground sometime during the reunion, though he could not have said precisely when, and he had drifted to his usual position present, but at the periphery, at the edge of things, where he had stood through most of the day. He watched her shape within the group, the way it settled and was absorbed, the way the bodies around her accommodated her pace and her slight unevenness without adjustment, without impatience, the way a family moves around its oldest member when it has found her again after loss. The calves were the last things clearly visible. Their smaller silhouettes bobbed at the edges of the adult bodies, round-headed, quick-legged, already beginning to play in the way calves resume playing almost immediately after a crisis has passed, because they are young enough that the world still reasserts its ordinary texture quickly. They disappeared into the adults, and the adults continued south, and the tree line received them by degrees, first the outermost figures, then the inner ones, and finally the last dark shape, which moved through the fringe of acacia shadow and was gone. The dust they had raised hung in the air for a while. It caught the late light, the particular amber gold of the Amboseli afternoon as it tips toward evening, and drifted slowly eastward on a wind too light to feel on skin but sufficient to move dust, sufficient to carry scent, sufficient to do the small and necessary work of dispersal that the air performs every evening without acknowledgement. Then the dust too was gone, and the southern corridor was simply itself again, dry grass, pale earth, the dark, uneven line of the tree line, the enormous sky above it all, beginning its slow migration from white to gold. Amara's team loaded the last of the cold storage cases into the vehicle. There was quiet conversation, technical, grounded, the careful language of people returning equipment and documentation to their proper order after a long field day. One of the junior team members made a note on a field tablet. Wound assessment, treatment administered, estimated recovery timeline, follow-up monitoring recommended. The ordinary bureaucracy of care, which is itself a form of love, rendered in columns and clinical language because that is the form it must take to be useful in the world beyond this afternoon. Amara paused before getting into the vehicle. She looked south for a moment, not long, just a moment, and then she looked at Samuel, and something passed between them that did not require words and did not receive any. Jonas made tea. He brought a cup out to Samuel without asking, and set it on the low concrete step beside him and went back inside. Because Jonas had been working with Samuel for 6 years and understood the particular quality of silence that required company but not conversation. Samuel sat on the step as the light changed. The sky above the Amboseli Basin performed its evening work with the unhurried thoroughness it brought to the task every day, regardless of what had happened beneath it, the white heat of midday dissolving first into a flat pile of gold, then into the deeper amber that preceded the color that only this particular sky in this particular part of the world produces, a red, so saturated and interior that it seemed to come from within the earth rather than from the atmosphere above it. The acacia silhouettes darkened against it. The grass lost its color and became shape. The first stars appeared in the east while the west was still burning. He had a photograph on his phone taken by Amara's field camera and sent to him in the last hour of the elephant standing in the morning dust, facing him, the dark glandular trails visible on her cheeks. He had looked at it once and then put the phone in his pocket. He was not ready yet to make it into a memory. It was still too close to being a fact. What he kept returning to, sitting there on the step with the cooling tea and the darkening sky, was not the reunion, as extraordinary as that had been. It was the earlier thing, the smaller thing. The 40 meters of open ground and an old elephant choosing, against everything instinct would have counseled, to cross them. The particular quality of trust that is not trust yet but is the first hesitant motion toward it, the willingness to remain in the presence of the unknown and see what it does. He had stayed, she had stayed, and the morning had become this. The red deepened along the western horizon until it was almost unbearable in its beauty, and then it began, slowly, to release, softening at the edges, the color drawing back into the earth from which it seemed to have come, leaving the sky above it a quiet, deepening blue. Somewhere in the southern tree line, invisible now in the dark, a herd of elephants was settling into the night together. Their breathing was slow, their bodies were warm against each other in the cooling air. The step was hard beneath him and the tea had gone cold, and Samuel did not move.